Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitors. For us to have a future that's exciting and inspiring, it has to be one where we're a space-bearing civilization. We must preserve the light of consciousness by becoming a spacefaring civilization and extending life to other planets. Elon Musk. Love is such a priceless treasure that you can buy the whole world with it and redeem not only your own, but other people's sins. Go and do not be afraid. Father Zosima, to Alyosha, the Brothers Karamazov. Well, hi everybody, and apologies for someone with my accent trying to say where. I still can't say it. Anyone from my neck of the woods is what's known in linguistics as diphthongally challenged, and double vowels sounds are incredibly difficult for us to pronounce, so I apologise. I should get a government grant for my inability to pronounce these words. But here we have, talk about boys and their toys. And sometimes people like Freud get a bad name for, reading sexual things into images and so on. But this does make me giggle slightly. And what I'm going to look at today, you can see from the statement, this is all about SpaceX, and this is from their own website. SpaceX was founded under the belief that a future where humanity is out exploring the stars is fundamentally more exciting than one where we're not. Again, where we? Yeah, where we? That's not too difficult. But making life multiplanetary. So that you've got here, obviously, Elon Musk. And here you have Jeff Bezos, and again, always with the boys' toys shaped rockets. But his organization or space exploration company is called Blue Origin, with the tagline for the benefit of Earth. And it says on their site, it's this generation's job to build a road to space so that future generations can unleash their creativity, because we have to go to space to do that. And just to go back, what drew me into this topic, because I did some videos on Musk and Bezos a while ago, but recently it rekindled my interest because there was a story that Musk had signed a new wage structure whereby they estimate, by if things fell into place, by 2027 he could possibly be the world's first trillionaire on the basis of the stock options, etc., that he's agreed. And I think I read about a year ago as well that at one point Bezos temporarily overtook Musk as the world's richest man. So they're vying with each other, Musk and Bezos. And both of them, as I've just shown, have these space exploration companies. And I'm going to go into that. And it's all part of this mindset that seems to think, what we need in the world is more and more of certain things. So the fact that they amass such wealth, even if they then try and do philanthropic acts, and I'm going to talk in a second about the concept of effective altruism, which has grown up, this idea that you can rationally apportion resources around the world. And there are various problems with that. But both of them seem to be obsessed with the conquering of distance and leaving Earth behind. And it's linked to, I'm going to go into this on a future occasion, but the concept of, whether you've heard of it, the singularity, the idea that eventually generalized artificial intelligence is going to create a scenario that's unique to humankind, where we basically pass over into some transhuman state where, augmented by AI, we are, new beings. And to some extent, you couldn't make this up. but it's seriously believed. There are, the people like Musk and Bezos are really, as you can, I've just given you the evidence, are really into space exploration and the idea, and it's this perennial thing that science ultimately will have the answers to nearly all human problems. And I'm going to look at that in the guise of Brothers Karamazov, and in particular, the concept of the Grand Inquisitor. And I'm going to be looking at Brothers Karamazov in a forthcoming live stream about 9 days from the filming of this one when this comes out, with my good friend Richard Grannon. And the Grand Inquisitor is a story within a story. It's what Ivan, when he talks to Alyosha, his brother, describes as a poem. And it's incredibly evocative. And I want to try and situate it to start providing some context for when I do talk about the Brothers Karamazov. But I'm going to talk about the Grand Inquisitor both as a self-contained story, but also I think it relates to Dostoevsky's work in general. Well, sorry, that book, Brothers Karamazov, it's not just a standalone story. It does relate to the broader novel as you'd expect. And in the epigraph, I quoted Father Zosima talking to Alyosha. And this idea that why this is what set me off on the whole thing. I'd heard about Musk and this potential $1 trillion contract. And then there's that phrase that Father Zosima says that you can buy the whole world. And he went on to say, with love. But you're getting to the stage where Bezos and Musk between them could almost buy the whole world just through their financial resources. So in and of themselves, because they're incredibly rich, since ancient times, the concept of being as rich as Croesus, and the Midas touch, being so wealthy, everything you touch turns to gold. These have been myths, and there have been incredibly rich people in the past. What interests me about these two characters in particular, Musk and Bezos, is, just to repeat, this way in which they're focusing upon space exploration and how they've allied themselves with new forms of philosophical perspectives that I would suggest overemphasize rationality. So in previous videos, I've looked at the work of Ian McGilchrist and the idea that we have left hemisphere and right hemisphere, bicameral divided brain, and in a healthy situation, both for the individual and society, both sides of the brain, cold logic and analogical creativity and metaphorical creativity, these are the things that we combine, are asymmetrical brain structures uniquely designed to combine both of these qualities of human life. And I'm going to suggest that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they emphasize the cold calculating rationality much more than the metaphorical, dare I say it, the spiritual, which we'll get into, because if nothing else, Brothers Karamazov is quite an overtly spiritual book, or it addresses spiritual issues, because one of the key protagonists, Ivan, is this self-avowed atheist who's constantly railing against religious belief. So here you've got a graphic for the way in which the Grand Inquisitor confronts, and within the story itself of the Grand Inquisitor, I don't think Jesus is ever called Jesus or Christ by name. It's he or him with capital H. And that's interesting, but it's obvious that it is Christ or Jesus. But I've done a list here of lots of literary sources or myths that address the concept of human power getting out of control and how to control it. And for me, the most interesting aspect of the Grand Inquisitor story is the way in which he, when faced with Jesus Christ himself, basically argues, and well, he doesn't argue because Christ never replies, which is fascinating as well. Christ stays silent, and at the very end, he does this kiss of forgiveness. And interestingly, he kisses the Grand Inquisitor on the lips, which he never does in the Bible. So that's Dostoevsky's own little spin on it. But all of these stories or myths I'm referring to, classically the Tower of Babel, the idea that God strikes down this tower that's attempting to reach the heavens. Well, that's got obvious parallels with Bezos and Musk and their space exploration, reaching for the heavens. You've got the golem myth throughout various Talmudic sources, the idea that, and it's about the creation of mankind itself. You know, Adam is a form of golem created from clay, but this idea that an anthropomorphized creature can exist that in some versions of the myth protects people in the Jewish ghetto, but in other versions gets out of control and is a danger. Then you've got Faust, the various versions ranging from Goethe to Christopher Marlowe to Thomas Mann, all these various writers dealing with the Faust myth, the idea of selling your soul in order to achieve something. Frankenstein, again, it's like an updated version of the golem. The concept that you can create a creature, and that's even more complicated because in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it's actually not so much the monster. Oh, sorry, I called him the monster. This is how it works. The creature that got labeled Frankenstein, remember, it's Dr. Frankenstein who made the creature, and the creature doesn't do anything wrong initially. The creature is turned into a monster by the fact the creator, Dr. Frankenstein, that gives, the name to the creature because he isn't named himself. The Dr. Frankenstein basically fails to acknowledge his own creation. So there's this thing of fatherhood and ownership. Then you've got H.G. Wells, The Island of Dr. Moreau, that the sick vivisectionist and experimenter raising questions of biomedical ethics. How far do you push science? Then you've got A Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde, that is a brilliant book about many themes, but narcissism, but also, again, this concept of when you take something too far, what happens? And then finally, so I'm just suggesting that the Grand Inquisitor as a story is part of this rich literary heritage of what happens when things get out of control. And the unique selling point, to use commercial terms, of the Grand Inquisitor is he's suggesting he has some type of solution because mankind left to its own devices cannot control its own creations. And there's this constant theme within the Grand Inquisitor of the story, of the concept of free will. The Grand Inquisitor basically berates Jesus for giving and encouraging free will amongst his followers, and his counter-argument is humankind cannot handle that level of freedom. And I mention all of these because I'm also going to talk later on about the concept of parable, which is a distinct form of narration. But all of these, whether it's parables, whether it's myths, whether it's stories just illustrated here, they all offer lessons, literary lessons. And this whole channel is about what's unique about literature, poetry, art, that science can't get its head around, what science can't do. And I'd suggest that literature, one of its great strengths is the way in which it actually illustrates the folly of humankind in a very elusive and allusive form. And in contrast to that, I want to show I'm going to potentially look at this in future if there's any interest, but William McCaskill is a relatively young, I think he's about 36, Oxford assistant professor in philosophy, and he wrote this book a few years ago, What We Owe the Future. And the link with Elon Musk is Elon Musk endorsed it on his X account and said, worth reading, this is a close match for my philosophy. And I'm trying to put it politely because my background is in philosophy, and I'm struggling to describe it other than saying it's what we owe the future is mad as a box of frogs. It sounds logical only if you accept its initial premises. But this is quite interesting because it fascinates me the way in which comedians and philosophers have this shared quality. Comedians do it for comic effect, philosophers do it as a sleight of hand. But if your initial assumptions are bogus, the subsequent reasoning can be spot on, but you have to try and hide the initial bogus assumptions. So just to give you specific examples, these are the type of statements he makes. Distance in time is like distance in space. Well, no. People matter even if they live thousands of miles away. Well, yes and no. Likewise, they matter even if they live thousands of years hence. Multiple no's or question marks. But this is part of his manifesto. We very often fail to think as carefully about helping others as we could, true, mistakenly believing that applying data and rationality to a charitable endeavour robs the act of virtue. Well, questionable. What could possibly go wrong, judging from human history, with the notion that you can act rationally and apply data and nothing could ever possibly go wrong? Let me think. And that means we pass up opportunities to make a tremendous difference. Yeah, Pol Pot, Stalin, and so on. But just as the world does not stop at our doorstep or our country's borders, neither does it stop with our generation or the next. No, because morality in central part is about, these are all taken out, they're not necessarily in context. This is just a selection, like a quality street or a lack of quality street selection of some of his sayings. I don't want you to think that they're all part of the same statement. Morality in central part is about putting ourselves in others' shoes and treating their interests as we do our own. Well, again, you could unpack that to the nth degree. Partially, and in other ways, no. Part of literature and art is the way in which you can only ever partially put yourself in someone else's shoes. And there's also a uniqueness in each human being. You can never fully put yourself in someone's shoes, and arguably you shouldn't try. Albeit, yes, there are ethical obligations we should have to each other. But the idea of treating their interests as we do our own, again, I dispute that in the way it's baldly stated. All of these things maybe sound vaguely plausible, but when you unpack them, I just think they're immensely problematic. So he's talking about the book. This book is about long-termism, the idea that positively influencing the long-term future is a key moral priority of our time. Well, maybe, but I think he never really fully proves his case, and I just think it's an assertion. I don't think it's a basis for morality. And before I go on to give you another critique of this, one of the things you'll notice at the very beginning, the concept of distance, and when I talked about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, their space exploration, their desire to conquer distance, it's a common theme, and I can see why Elon Musk endorsed this book. But what I like about fiction and art is good fiction and good art actually tries to maintain distance and the tension that distance provides. So, for example, my go-to example for lots of these things when you mention time is obviously Proust à la recherche de temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time. And in that book, which we'll be doing in a future reading group, there's a constant tension between time that's passed and the narrator and his experience of memories of that time and how it intrudes upon the present, which isn't that time, but is affected by memories of that past time. There's a constant tension. And as a human being, psychologically, you can't conquer memory and time past. So distance in time is like distance in space. No, you can measure distance in space. And even then, if you go for a walk, for example, it will feel longer or shorter depending on what mood you're in. So the way in which human beings experience the world is much more complicated than even this very first statement. Distance in time is like distance in space. It might be like, but there are lots of problems with the loose analogy that he then tries to build a whole philosophy upon. And just to repeat, fiction tends to... So I'll give you a specific example of the Grand Inquisitor. In that story, Dostoevsky's distancing himself from some of the views expressed by telling the story. And he's then doing it further by Ivan telling it as a character of Dostoevsky, and Ivan himself distancing himself from the story by saying it's just a poem I wrote for a bit of a laugh. So and then it's distance in time because it's set at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. So there are levels of distance, and it's all part of the story. Whereas McCaskill, Bezos, and Musk, their whole ethos is the conquering of distance. And I just think there's something questionable about this inability or unwillingness to accept distance in various forms. And then I quite like this. This was a critique, quoting from an essay, this guy Paris Marx. It's a bit of a bourgeois name, isn't it? Long-termism is a technocratic dream that purports to give some of the wealthiest people in the world the ability to plan the far future of humanity according to their personal whims. It is hubris, treating billions of people as the pawns of godlike billionaire overseers who hoard unthinkable fortunes and constantly seek new ways to manufacture consent for their dominance. We owe it to ourselves and the future to stop it in its tracks. So I think Paris Marx here is, or is it Paris Marx? He's turning on its head this idea that we owe it to the future. He's saying we owe it to the future to stop these odd thinkers and billionaires, soon to be trillionaires. So this is the counter argument, but I want to go into some specifics, and what I want to do is bring together some ideas from past videos to help, because I'm sure some of you think I just ramble off on different themes and topics and none of them are ever linked. But I have looked at the concept of perspective in art and how we've come to measure the world in a scientific way. And what I find interesting about that is that you can see, if you go far back enough, the claim is that in the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, there was a new scientific way of looking at the world. And I just think you can, behind the views of Musk and Bezos and McCaskill, there is this demonstrable relationship to distance, as I've started to argue. And you can actually see how it arose in our society and how, left to its own devices, as Ian McGilchrist would point out, it's only one half of the equation. So this is the Baptistery in Florence. Beautiful, beautiful building. And this is when you start to geometrically deconstruct it. And then this is Filippo, was it Filippo? I think it was. Filippo Brunelleschi. And this is how he did a painting, a drawing of the Baptistery. And now he's looking at the actual Baptistery itself through the back of his reproduction, through a mirror. It's incredibly clever, given that he's just using quite simple equipment. But he's trying to replicate and simulate so he can superimpose his representation of the building over the actual real building. And I think in a past video I pointed out what's interesting is at the top of his little picture he had to use polished silver because the one thing he couldn't replicate was the movement of the clouds, because you can capture so much with science. I just think it's a lovely little metonymic idea that the cloud, there's always something missing in any representation, and art and literature recognizes that from the get-go. But science always fools itself into thinking it can provide a perfect equivalence, and there's always something missing of reality in any scientific representation, is what I'd argue. But this is just visual. It's very difficult to explain in words what he's doing, so this is another additional visual representation of what he was doing. It shows you the superimposition of his drawing or painting with the actual building itself. And then you can see how all this fits into a mathematical deconstruction of the world itself. And then I'm arguing this is what it leads to. Ultimately, this is the Bezos and Musk mentality, that once you have this attitude to distance and space, this is inevitably what you're led to do. Now, I've previously referred to Koestler's work, and just as a throwaway comment, I don't want to upset anyone, a slightly controversial comment. Koestler wrote, and I'll explore or I'll discuss exactly what he wrote and its relevance to all this in a second. But he was writing about often totalitarian regimes and a certain ideological mindset. And when you talk about those type of issues, I'd argue that the two most famous novels that tend to get mentioned are George Orwell's 1984 and perhaps Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. But I'm just throwing it out there that I actually think Darkness at Noon from 1940 is better than both of those. Better in the sense that I think psychologically it's more subtle. And I don't know, my controversial statements I think I'd make is that I think George Orwell he was a journalist, and not disparaging journalists, but I think it shows in his writing, and if you want to be a literary snob about it, I just think Koestler was a much better writer. But anyway, this title, Darkness at Noon, it comes from the Book of Job. They meet with darkness in the daytime and grope in the noonday, as in the night. So I'll be quoting some notions from Darkness at Noon that I think are really helpful to understand the Musk and Bezos mentality. And also, there's a relatively little known essay he did, The Yogi and the Commissar, 1942. And then, relevant to the whole rising issue of generalized artificial or artificial general intelligence, is this book, The Ghost and the Machine, that's quite famous. The extent to which we can think of our brains as machine-like, and to what extent we still have these primeval, primitive aspects. And can we, so these are all these ideas in artificial intelligence about transhumanism, will we ever ultimately be able to upload our consciousness? All of these type of issues, I think, were foreseen to some extent in Koestler's writing. So this is a quote I'm going to give you. Rubashov is the protagonist. He's this Bolshevik who's been in the Communist Party for decades of his life, and finally the inevitable happens and he's arrested. So Rubashov stared out through the window bars, he's already been arrested in prison, at the little patch of blue above the machine gun tower. Looking back, it seemed he had spent 40 years in a mad frenzy, in a rampage of pure reason. Perhaps it wasn't healthy for people to cut off the old ties, to disengage the brakes of thou shalt not and thou mayest, and go racing toward their goal unchecked. And I hope you're seeing why I'm quoting this, because the rampage of pure reason reminds me of McGaskill's What We Owe the Future book. And the idea that when you get rid of thou shalt not and thou mayest, it's a theme that comes up in Brothers Karamazov. When nothing is forbidden, everything is allowed, what happens then? But in the case of, to go back to that original epigraph, the idea that you can buy the whole world, Father Zosima's talking about love, but to repeat, someone like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos can buy the world they can just buy the world. So this idea of thou shalt not and thou mayest, the limits have just been taken off them. They can go racing toward their goal unchecked, and they go racing in the form of rocket ships like little boys. The sky had begun to redden, dusk was falling, a flock of dark birds was circling the tower with slowly flapping wing beats. The equation did not add up. it was evidently not enough to give people a goal to set their sights on and a scalpel to hold. Experimenting with the knife was not a healthy thing to do, which I think is resonant with at least one pressing social issue I can think of. But this statement, the equation did not add up. It's a theme also in Crime and Punishment with the protagonist Raskolnikov, who tries to adopt a bit of a McGaskill utilitarian, what's for the greater good, I'm a young aspiring great person, I could be the next Napoleon, and this old evil woman, this pawnbroker, is stymieing my development. So on a utilitarian basis, Raskolnikov's basically arguing for future generations, it's better that I kill this woman. But the point is, the equation did not add up. The point is made throughout Darkness at Noon and by Dostoevsky with Raskolnikov. Utilitarian equations don't work with human beings. Human beings shouldn't be subject to equations. And you'd think, with all the great social experiments that have failed in history, philosophers like McCaskill would be a bit more savvy about this idea that Musk and Bezos can just keep going after more and more and more, whether it's money and or technology. I said it before, but what could possibly go wrong? And then again in Darkness at Noon, this is Rubashov describing to his interrogator. He mentions Crime and Punishment. It deals with the question of whether the student Raskolnikov had the right to kill the old woman. He's young and talented, looking at a new lease on life. She is old and of no use whatsoever to the world, but the equation doesn't add up. First of all, the circumstances are such that he's forced to kill another person as well. There's an accident that happens, he doesn't mean to, but he kills another. And however you pass this one, the woman he kills is completely innocent. And those are exactly the unforeseeable and illogical consequences of every seemingly simple and logical, practical deed. I think that should be tattooed on McCaskill's forehead. And second, the equation doesn't add up because Raskolnikov discovers that 2 times 2 does not equal 4 if the arithmetic involves living beings. So he presses this point, but I just think it's so crucial. If you are versed to any extent in art and literature, the William McCaskill arguments just great because they're so utilitarianly driven and they're about every seemingly simple and logical practical deed. He fails to see what I've emboldened and italicized there. That I'm just using Koestler as an example. Many, many writers have warned us since the earliest part of human history about hubris, about the arrogance of thinking we can find rational solutions to everything. And then in his essay, The Yogi and the Commissar, I love this quote. The Commissar believes in change from without. He believes that all the pests of humanity, including constipation and the Oedipus complex, can and will be cured by revolution. That this end justifies the use of all means, including violence, ruse, treachery, and poison. So, I'm not accusing Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos of resorting to treachery and poison, but I do think there's an element of the end justifies the use of all means. And in the book, What We Owe the Future also, I think that's a problem. And one way of thinking about it is, there's an adolescent quality. I think Koestler uses the phrase repressed puberty, which I think is really insightful, because there's a certain quality to people like Elon Musk that they've never fully grown up. In a sense, spiritual life can be defined as the training for the acceptance of death. The Commissar is the human type least advanced in this training, and yet by a force of circumstances, most advanced towards its aim. Thus, the artist shows the least resistance against being carried away, the revolutionary the greatest. The Commissar can be defined as the human type which has completely severed relations with the subconscious. In fact, he is condemned to live in a permanent state of repressed puberty. There you go. While in a normal curriculum, the great crisis of adolescence, the confrontation with the tragic and insoluble problems of existence occurs only once, a limited process like teething. Yet, though living in a climate of perpetual adolescence, his behaviour is as unadolescent, unecstatic, and unromantic as can be imagined. One has the feeling that his subconscious has been dealt with not on the analyst's sofa but on the surgeon's table by the amputating knife. So it's this, what Koestler's doing here is this getting into the mindset of the Commissar, this person who's at a repressed level of puberty. They've never come to terms with their own mortality. The Commissar can be defined as the human type which has completely severed relations with the subconscious. So this notion of being carried away, the whole romantic poets, the least resistance being against being carried away. The revolutionary, the greatest resistance against being carried away. The revolutionary gives themselves over to these cold, calculating, utilitarian equations. The artist is much more likely to see the emotional side get carried away. And this is a crucial difference. So it goes back to, I just want to show it again. He'd spent 40 years in a mad frenzy and a rampage of pure reason. This is the consequence of this repressed puberty. Perhaps it wasn't healthy for people to cut off the old ties, to disengage the brakes of thou shalt not and thou mayest, and go racing off toward their goal unchecked. So I've put these next to each other because I wanted to re-emphasize the yogi and the Commissar is his non-fictional writing. He's trying to get into the mindset of this personality type, the Commissar, and that's what the novel does here. And this is Rubashov again talking. We learned history more thoroughly than the others. What separates us from everyone else is our consistency. People considered us fanatics because we were so consistent, because we carried our thoughts and actions to their logical conclusions. People compared us to the Inquisition because, like them, we always felt responsibility for a hereafter, a future that transcended the individual. Like the Great Inquisitors, we attempted to root out evil, not only by prosecuting deeds, we delved into thoughts themselves. We refused to acknowledge any private sphere, not even in the innermost space within the skull. So McCaskill's is what we owe to the future. I think it's summarised brilliantly here. People compared us to the Inquisition because, like them, we always felt the responsibility for a hereafter, a future that transcended the individual. This is what I found scary about the whole philosophy that, that Elon Musk has put his name to, or he says he associates with. A future that transcended the individual. The individual gets downgraded. And this concept of future, people who haven't even lived yet are given equal moral standing, which maybe need to go into on another occasion. It just strikes me as it's very resonant with this mentality that's being described here. And there's they compared us to the Inquisition, which has obvious links to Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor. So what I want to do now is to think of the Grand Inquisitor's story as parable, and what is unique about parable. So this is from the Gospel of St. Mark, which is the next Agnostic Guide to the Bible live stream topic. The whole Gospel of St. Mark will be looking at, me and Joshua, or Joshua and I. But he did not speak to them without parable. It needs to be developed in future in much more depth, which I will do, but the concept of it's a particular technical type of narration. And I just think this is an absolutely amazing book. The Genesis of Secrecy on the Interpretation of Narrative. And he was an agnostic like myself. I think he was born in the Isle of Man. I think, because I remember reading in his autobiography, he was singing hymns. He was talking about the concept of being a cultural Christian, but he was singing hymns in Manx, which is the language, indigenous language on the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man's a very small island, not far off the coast in the Irish Sea, not that far from Liverpool. But I think it's a form of Gaelic, but it's a unique form of Gaelic that they speak on the Isle of Man. But it's a stunningly good book, and in it, he uses the example of the Gospel of St. Mark, not from a religious point of view, but as the subtitle there implies, he delves into its narrative structure. And if you can get hold of a copy and you're prepared to put the work in, it's difficult, but I think it's absolutely stunning. Brilliant analysis of the literary qualities of biblical writing. I can't recommend that book highly enough. But this is from his autobiography, Not Entitled, which is an ironic title because I think he was knighted, so he had the title of Sir. From poetry and music I derived the little I know about holiness. They continue to inform me. I am well aware that there are other kinds of holiness, kinds that I can hopelessly admire, that impel people into action, tending AIDS patients or children dying in poverty. Also other kinds that call for silence, a sacrifice almost unimaginable to unholy talkers. And that has direct relevance to the Grand Inquisitor story, because the Grand Inquisitor doesn't let Jesus speak whatsoever. He just talks at him. And the silent kiss at the end that Jesus gives the Grand Inquisitor, that is, in the whole story, I think he speaks once, Jesus, to the small child he resurrects, who's dead in a coffin. I think he says, I've forgotten, is it Talitha? It's the phrase in Aramaic. But that's all he says. He says nothing to the Grand Inquisitor. So why I've picked on that idea, the fact he says nothing, this idea of silence and the enigmatic element of not saying anything and the underlying truth that can hide behind not saying something, as opposed to, I love this phrase, almost unimaginable to unholy talkers, says the man talking endlessly into a camera. If we want to think about narratives that mean more and other than they seem to say, and mean different things to different people, with a particularly sharp distinction drawn between those who are outside and those who are inside, we can hardly do better than consider the parables. So just to repeat, I will be doing more stuff on parables in future, but I want to highlight it here because the enigmatic quality of parables, the not saying very much while saying a lot, as embodied in the character of Jesus in front of the Grand Inquisitor. That's almost what the parable of the Grand Inquisitor is doing. It's there, but it's not saying much, but actually it's saying everything without sounding too much like a Chinese fortune cookie. And I'm opposing this to this notion that you can have a utilitarian equation, the thing that Koestler's making fun of. In human activity, equations, the arithmetic notion that you can quantify everything. He's just saying it doesn't work. And it's the exact antithesis to the notion of a parable, which is by its nature enigmatic. Parable, it seems, may proclaim a truth as a herald does. So it's speaking it, and at the same time conceal truth like an oracle. This double function, this simultaneous proclamation and concealment, will be a principal theme of what follows. This is early on in the book. For I shall concern myself with the radiant obscurity of narratives, somewhat longer than parables, though still subject to these hermetic ambivalences. I'll explain hermetic ambivalence in a second. But please try and keep in your memory with the radiant obscurity of narratives. I'm going to return to this concept of radiant obscurity, which I think is a self-evident contradiction. But again, this is what parables do. They can seem to be contradictory, and yet there's a radiant obscurity, this contradictory quality that both shines light, proclaims a truth, but at the same time conceals truth like an oracle. Whereas I strongly suspect the Musk-Bezos philosophy is much more about truth being unconcealed, truth being out in the open, truth being reducible, as McGaskill suggests, to these utilitarian equations. Distance equated with time, they can both be conquered. This isn't what literature or parables are about. So this notion of hermetic, again, it's the beauty of language. You can't reduce this. These are concomitant, simultaneous meanings. So it airtight, and hermetic seal prevents air from getting in or out. Tupperware is airtight, hermetically sealed. Isolated, a person leading a hermetic life, pretty much myself, is one who is solitary and cut off from society, voluntarily, I hasten to add. Obscure, a hermetic discussion might be one that is difficult to understand and only makes sense to a select group of people with specialized knowledge. And this is where you get the sense of, Commode argues that interpretation of literature and art is to some extent an hermetic activity, because there are ways of interpreting that the initiated have the advantage over the uninitiated. And obviously, when we look at St. Mark's Gospel, this is the theme that comes up. Why does Jesus speak in parables? It's discussed. Now I'm showing you this because, having discussed the notion of the Grand Inquisitor, I thought it might be just useful, if you just indulge me, to show, I never need an excuse to show Francis Bacon paintings. But this is, you'll see shortly, Francis Bacon did a whole series of quite obsessive representations of this original image. This was from approximately 1650, Velázquez and his portrait of Pope Innocent X. So what I'm going to do is then look at some of the things the Grand Inquisitor says in the short story and alternate it with some images from Francis Bacon's interpretation of this original painting, which is just the eyes. You wonder what he did to be Pope. But this is the Grand Inquisitor in the story talking to Jesus. Decide yourself who was right. You are the one who questioned you then. He's talking about the temptation in the desert when the devil tempts Jesus with 3 questions. Recall the first question. Its meaning, though not literally, was this. You want to go into the world, and you are going empty-handed with some promise of freedom, which they, in their simplicity and innate lawlessness, cannot even comprehend, which they dread and fear, for nothing has ever been more insufferable for man and for human society than freedom. But do you see these stones in this scorching desert? Turn them into bread, and mankind will run after you like sheep, grateful and obedient, though eternally trembling, lest you withdraw your hand and your loaves cease for them. But you did not want to deprive man of freedom and rejected the offer. For what sort of freedom is it, you reasoned, if obedience is bought with loaves of bread? So the Grand Inquisitor is saying to Jesus, you could have accepted the devil's offer and given humanity the bread it needs to survive, and you would have had the complete obedience of these sheep-like people. But Jesus refuses because he values human freedom. And this is a theme. It may take me a few videos to fully cover it, but it's why I think the Grand Inquisitor story is so evocative, because it deals head on with this incredibly complex issue of free will and its role in humanity. To what extent can we be fully human without free will? Or to what extent is material comfort more important? And this wasn't rediscovered. This was painted in 1946, and it's much less well known than Francis Bacon's other paintings in the Pope series. And it was found in a private collection. A catalogue was being put together, and the researcher found this in a private collection in 2016. So for 70 years it was missing. And it's called Landscape with Pope / Dictator. So you can see the microphone. It's almost like a Mussolini type dictator shouting into the microphone. Here's just a close-up of the mouth. For reasons that will become clear. So this is the Grand Inquisitor still talking. You objected that man does not live by bread alone. But do you know that in the name of this very earthly bread, the spirit of the earth will rise against you and fight with you and defeat you, and everyone will follow him, exclaiming, who can compare to this beast, for he has given us fire from heaven? Do you know that centuries will pass, and mankind will proclaim with the mouth of its wisdom and science that there is no crime and therefore no sin, but only hungry men? Feed them first, then ask virtue of them. That is what they will write on the banner they raise against you, and by which your temple will be destroyed. In place of your temple, a new edifice will be raised. The terrible Tower of Babel will be raised again, and though, like the former one, this one will not be completed either, still you could have avoided this new tower and shortened people's suffering by 1,000 years. For it is to us they will come after suffering for 1,000 years with their tower. So this is the Grand Inquisitor claiming that because you won't feed the people, because you believe, he's saying this to Jesus, because Jesus believes in free will and the ultimate sanctity of that, he didn't take the offer to feed people. So the people will give their faith to science, the science that will feed them. But ultimately that too will fail. This terrible Tower of Babel will be raised again. Because elsewhere, the Grand Inquisitor argues people just aren't equipped, even with science, to justly share out the products of science, the food it can create. So ultimately science will let people down. But it will take them a long time to realise that. But then they will come back to people like the Grand Inquisitor, who will do this double act. He will both feed them and offer them spiritual solace, even though it's a fake, it's a deceptive form of solace, because he takes the free will. He basically tells the people, I know the secrets, I know the mysteries, put your faith in me and be part of my church, and all your problems, spiritual problems, will be gone. Whereas the undercurrent of all this is that Jesus was actually expecting much more from people. He was giving them much more credit, or more of a challenge. They have to find him through conscious, well, not even conscious, but a leap of faith, Kierkegaard calls it, rather than, and it's difficult and it's mysterious and you don't know the nature of the leap you're making in advance, whereas the Grand Inquisitor's version is a decaffeinated version of that that's not as frightening. This is just called Untitled parentheses Pope from 1953 to 4. They will seek us out again underground in catacombs, hiding, for again we shall be persecuted and tortured. They will find us and cry out, feed us, for those who promised us fire from heaven did not give it. And then we shall finish building their tower, for only he who feeds them will finish it, and only we shall feed them in your name, for we shall lie that it is in your name. Oh, never, never will they feed themselves without us. No science will give them bread as long as they remain free. But in the end, they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, better that you enslave us, but feed us. So it's again this question of freedom. And my reading is I need to spend more time on this when Richard and I look at in the live stream and possibly other videos too. For those who promised us fire from heaven did not give it. I'm reading that as saying that science can feed you but not spiritually. They promised us fire from heaven, but there's something lacking in the scientific perspective, the scientific philosophy. And that's where the Grand Inquisitor comes in. But the price of the consolation and the solace of the Grand Inquisitor is that better that you enslave us, but feed us. So the price you pay for the Grand Inquisitor's version of spirituality is you check your free will in at the door. So remember the original Velázquez painting of Pope Innocent X. This is called Study After Velázquez, Portrait of Pope Innocent X, and this is from 1953. And this is a different painting in the same series, but this was the original inspiration. It's from famous scene in Battleship Potemkin on the Odessa steppes. And he just painted painting after painting on this theme. Again, the Grand Inquisitor. They will finally understand that freedom and earthly bread in plenty for everyone are inconceivable together, for never, never will they be able to share among themselves. They'll also be convinced that they are forever incapable of being free because they are feeble, depraved non-entities and rebels. You promise them heavenly bread, but I repeat again, can it compare with earthly bread in the eyes of the weak? Eternally depraved, an eternally ignoble human race. Now, this is an interesting take in the Grand Inquisitor story. Jesus is presented as this incredibly humble figure. In mostly, this isn't really a tradition in Catholicism, but in the Eastern Orthodox churches, this is figures known as Jesus Christ, Pantocrator. In other words, God Almighty, ruler of the world, Pantocrator. So it's God as a powerful, inspirational figure. Or sorry, Jesus is a powerful, inspirational figure. And this is a mosaic in the Hagia Sophia from Istanbul. Now, the Grand Inquisitor, he identifies three methods of maintaining control over people. And they match the three questions the devil tempted Jesus with in the desert during the 40 days and nights. So it's miracle, mystery, and authority. Now, miracle and authority are quite easy to understand, but the mystery, what's the Grand Inquisitor talking about when he talks about mystery and how you use that to control people? And it's implicit in the previous quotes I've given you, but just to try and explain it a bit more. So this is all my words, just trying to explain at least a bit more the previous quotes. So the problem is that free will consists of a mixture of reason and conscience. When we're faced with reality as embodied creatures, so as human beings, we're in the world. So none of this nonsense shall we upload our consciousness to a vat and we will become transhumanist, generalized artificial intelligences. This is the weird dream of these billionaires. But when we're faced with reality as embodied creatures, that creates conundrums that go beyond science and its equations. These were the quotes at the beginning about from Koestler. You know, Raskolnikov, the arithmetic doesn't apply to people. So what are the choices? I mentioned earlier Kierkegaard's leap of faith. Or you submit yourself to the authority of the church in the form of the Grand Inquisitor. So in other words, you sacrifice your conscience and the anxiety that your conscience produces for peace of mind. So the Grand Inquisitor solves, when I say the mystery is that science doesn't have all the answers. So then we turn to religion, which is mysterious. But Jesus's version of the mystery is that it's difficult. You have to have faith in him. You have to make this Kierkegaard leap of faith. The Grand Inquisitor substitutes that for this transaction. So the underlying remaining mystery is how we have free faith in God without evidence or confirmatory authority. So the main mystery in religion is this leap of faith. What are you leaping into? It's this abyss of not knowing, but you're being asked to have faith in God. The Grand Inquisitor's version of this mystery, he has a different mystery, but it's a fake mystery, because what he does, he sidesteps the issue because he knows that the vast majority of people can't handle the challenge Jesus gave them. So he has his version of the Catholic Church in the story, which dupes the people, but the people are willingly duped because they want to sacrifice their own conscience and their own anxiety to be told the Grand Inquisitor and his ilk will take care of everything. So he's playing this moral utilitarian calculus. He says it explicitly throughout the story. Only a very small number of people are capable of doing what Jesus wants or is asking them to do. So his version, although it's deceptive, the Grand Inquisitor's claiming what he's doing may be deceptive, but actually it's for the greater good because it will apply to more people. And this is the same type of calculus that the Bezos, Musk, and McCaskill are all promoting, especially with this bizarre idea that future generations, divorced from the here and now, are still our moral equivalents. And this is another depiction of Christ Pantocrator in the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I just think it's stunning the way that the image looks down on you from this, dome. So this is a view looking up, and you can see the windows shining light. It's quite dramatic. But this all feeds into this God-looking, Jesus looking from up above, this Christ the Almighty, the ruler of the world. This is, I think, the oldest depiction, the oldest icon of this image of Christ Pantocrator. And what's interesting is if you look closely, there are two different. Basically, the face has been divided vertically. So on the left-hand side, that's Christ as the bearer of mercy and grace. And on the right-hand side, that's the judge. That's the more severe Christ. But I'd suggest in the Grand Inquisitor, this is more like the Jesus that's presented. So this is called Christ in the Desert, Ivan Kramskoy from 1872. And in Christianity, the theology, it's called kenosis. This idea that in order to become human, God emptied himself out of his godliness. It's complicated because was he simultaneously God and human being? But kenosis refers to this emptying out so that he could experience life as a human being. And then this reminds me, what is truth? Christ and Pilate. It's a Nikolai. It's G.E., so it's a Russian name. Gay, I'm guessing. But Nikolai G.E. Gay from 1890. But that's the same type of Jesus I'd suggest that's depicted in the story of the Grand Inquisitor. Humble, unassuming, not saying anything. So just to start finishing up, there's, to link all this together, the notion of parables not being about utilitarian, easily defined concepts. They're ambiguous, they're enigmatic, are phrases I've kept using. But this is from Psalms. The Lord hath chastened me sore, but he hath not given me over unto death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, I will go into them and I will praise the Lord. The gate of the Lord into which the righteous shall enter. So what I wanted to emphasize is the concept of doors now. So this is quite a famous painting. There are various versions of it, but it's The Light of the World from 1851 to 1854. And he was an English pre-Raphaelite artist, William Holman Hunt. And this is based on Revelation. I'm trying to remember. It's chapter 3, verse 20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me. But what's interesting, this doorway, it's overgrown and there's no handle or anything to go in. It's locked from the inside, which is obviously metaphorical. And on this, I'm relating this to the concept of parables, and I'll explain at the very end. But this idea of trying to get in through the door and the gate or the doorway to truth, it's not clear in parables and in literature and in narratives. The truth, it's Corinthians seeing as through a glass darkly, but the idea is when you meet God you will see clearly. But this phrase, through a glass darkly, and parables are dark riddles, they're dark stories in the sense they're opaque. So this is what you're seeing in the imagery. And again, this concept of, in Hebrew tradition, assuredly without entering through that gate one will never gain access to the Most High King. Imagine a king greatly exalted who screens himself from the common view behind gate upon gate, and at the end one special gate, locked and barred. And I'm quoting this because some of you may remember I did, not that long ago, a video on Charlie Kirk in the context of Before the Law, the Kafka parable. It's not even a short story, it's written in such a short form. It's more obviously, it fits the bill of a parable. And in future I will go into the technical definitions, what qualifies strictly as a parable and what may not. Now, that which requires to be disclosed must first have been covered, and this view of interpretation certainly implies that the sense of the parable is an occult sense. Its defenders like to say, not that the interpreter illumines the text, but that the text illumines the interpreter, like a radiance. Remember earlier on I asked you to remember that seemingly self-contradictory phrase. I think there was roughly opaque radiance. The contradiction that something dark could also be radiant. And I think this is why I'm borderline obsessed with Kafka. Because Kafka sums up this genesis of secrecy that Frank Kermode is talking about. The text illumines the interpreter like a radiance. So this is the part of the end, the very end of Before the Law, which is a very short story stroke parable from Kafka. Before I show you the actual text, apologies, but the setup is, there's this man from the countryside he's described at. He comes before this door where there's a doorkeeper, and he can see behind the doorkeeper there are other doors, and it's full of light. And he asks to go through, and the doorkeeper says, no, you can't. So he sits on a stool nearby, and he stays there for decades, and he's never allowed through. So it's a really enigmatic, weird story. And this is the end of it. Finally, his eyesight weakens, and he does not know whether it's really getting darker around him, or whether his eyes are merely deceiving him. Yet he now perceives amidst the darkness a radiance, remember that word, which bursts out inextinguishably from the door of the law. He does not live much longer. Before he dies, all the experiences of the whole time come together in his mind as a question that he has not yet asked the doorkeeper. He beckons to him, for he can no longer straighten his stiffening body. The doorkeeper has to bend down low to him, for the difference in height has greatly changed to the disadvantage of the man. So now, what else do you want to know? The doorkeeper asks. You are insatiable. But everyone strives towards the law, the man said. How is it that during those many years no one except for me requested admission? The doorkeeper realizes that the man is nearing his end, and in order to reach his diminished hearing, he roars at him. Nobody else could be admitted here, since this entrance was intended for you alone. I shall go now and close it. So it's this amazing, it's what Frank Kermode's talking about, this simultaneously the oracle and the herald, the thing being declared and the thing being hidden simultaneously. This is what parables definitely do, and I'd argue all good literature does. It simultaneously explains and covers up. And just go right back to the beginning of this talk. This is what I'm suggesting. This philosophy of using calculus and using effective altruism and trying to calculate in an arithmetical way what we might owe future generations and so on. It contains all the problems Koestler identifies as this, I'd suggest, not transhuman partaking of artificial intelligence and all that. I'd argue it's actually deeply inhuman, because it's not who we are as human beings. So just to finish with one final image, it's called The Door from 1884. And it's a Helene and a Scherfbeck, Scherfbeck. So Scherfbeck, I'm guessing. Scherfbeck. But I think it summarizes beautifully this concept of art and literature and parables, the way in which they stand against the arrested, pubertal, boyish, really unsophisticated philosophical approach that excessively relies upon technology, and the why in the title I referred to the Grand Acquisitors, this idea that you can just keep amassing great amounts of wealth like Bezos and Musk, and or technology like Bezos and Musk, and that will somehow reveal some truth, that will break down the distance that they think. McCaskill argues distance in space and time are the same thing. And no, literature and art always maintain the distance. They're always radiance, but it's radiance behind a closed door. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Until the next time, all the very best.